even those themes around the way that you can annihilate another person without touching them physically. It's like the horror that we expose ourselves to through love and through trust. No Country for Old Men feels like maybe the most obvious influence on the movie when you just watch it. But I'm also very, very grateful to the Coen brothers for decades of incomparable cinema, but because when I said I wanted to start the movie with an act of violence and then really start pulling away and making the violence less and less explicit, there were some people who didn't want me to do that. But being able to say, well, it's really the No Country for Old Men model, and when you reference an absolute masterpiece, generally people go, oh, okay, yeah. So I'm grateful to the Coen brothers for a lot of things, but it helped me win a couple of battles there. I feel like Le Bonheur does a really great job of creating that absolutely kind of terrifying, skin-crawling feeling in a way that really feels like a magic trick. There are movies where, you know, even if you're not really conscious as you're watching it, you could probably explain why a certain sequence was so unsettling to you. And I love or hate, it's always hard to describe, the way that you're watching something unfold in a way that's so pleasant that you're wondering, like, how is it that I feel like I'm gonna be sick when everything in this movie feels beautiful, lovely, saturated, warm? It's like I wanna be at that picnic, but also it feels like the stakes are really life and death. But also, you know, specifically there's a sequence where it's like a kind of blending of the husband and his mistress, and those shots are really like hyper composed and very deliberate. So the reference in the film probably isn't obvious, but there's a scene where, without giving much away, I'll say two characters wake up next to each other, and I wanted that sequence to feel almost perversely intimate. And again, I think of Le Bonheur and I think of like the perverseness of the way that it's presented versus the emotion underneath it. And what's happening is this kind of disconnect, but the illusion of intimacy. It's two people who are really lying to each other about what's actually happening, but it's like this girl is saying, hey, if you get on board with this reality, we can both walk out of here safe. Physically, emotionally, if we're just on board with the same lie, we're gonna be fine. And even the way that it's kind of shot, it's actually on the wrong side of the line, but I wanted it to feel like that perversion of intimacy. Like this feels like a scene we've seen before, and yet something very different is happening. And they're kind of going in and out of each other's frames, and you know, sometimes you can only see one of their eyes, and you're kind of straining to see like what is actually happening in this scene. And so there were some visual references that I pulled from that film. And actually, this isn't on the list, but my DP got on board with the idea of shooting it on the wrong side of the line, only because he was like, well, maybe it falls under the principle from Prisoners. There's like a scene with Jake Gyllenhaal and Maria Bello, and he's like, technically that's on the wrong side of the line, but it does feel right, because he's like a real stickler, which I love about him. But yeah, I love everything about the way that scene is performed and feels, because there is something about it visually that you know is wrong. There's something deeply disturbing happening in that scene, and so I wanted it to reflect that. First of all, I think Clued is like one of the coolest movies ever made. But I'll also say there were like a surprising number of like hyper-specific things that informed the movie. It was something I wanted to rewatch like right before making the movie, because there's a sequence that is 1971 New York, and it is 1971 New York. And so I was even looking at some behind the scenes photos, and I didn't really want like the wardrobe, for example, in the movie to feel like so hyper 70s that it allowed you to kind of think, man, the 70s were a tricky time for women because it is still kind of a universal thing. But I was looking at some behind the scenes photos, and as I was looking at it, I'm looking at Jane Fonda and I'm going, no, I mean, I guess, this is really how people dressed, and it maybe isn't super costumey. And then I noticed, like, some of the behind the scenes photos, they're filming on the street, and I just started looking at all the people on the street and all the crew members. And so I gave it to my costume designers as a reference of, like, not what Jane Fonda's wearing, what the crew members are wearing and what the people on the street are wearing, because I wanted it to feel as grounded as possible. Also, this is silly, but it's not silly to me. I really wanted all the women in the movie to be connected to a piece of nature, because we have such limited time with them and we're really meeting them on the worst moment of their life. And I wanted the backdrop of their scenes to speak to, the vastness and complexity of their life beyond the moment that we're meeting them in. And the one that I couldn't really figure out was the character of Charlie, who's in New York. And I was like, actually going down the path of going, like, what do I have a bunch of paintings in her New York apartment of nature? Like, what do I do? And I noticed that in Clute she has this beautiful vaulted skylight. So I was like, oh, maybe I can have the production build a skylight, in some, crappy little studio space that we're probably gonna have to build that apartment in. And like the location manager found an apartment with a vaulted skylight. And so we actually got to like shoot that skylight, and that's her connection to, the wider world and that corner of nature. And so then, of course, because I was like, now I want to prove that we were actually there, I was like, oh my gosh, I could shoot on the roof. And that would also continue this theme of really only seeing certain acts of violence through glass and at a distance, because it feels too intense to be really up close in those explicit moments. There's that scene when she's in a casting office where she's being talked about as though she's not there. And I'd forgotten about that scene, and so I called the screenwriter and I asked him to write in this moment where these two casting directors are talking about Cheryl as though she's not there. And that's really when I thought, well, I wonder if there's a way to write it that it would be unclear for a little while who they're talking about. And are they talking about the victim that we've just seen? Are they talking about someone else? And I wanted it to feel really kind of disorienting. And that kind of led me down a path of figuring out, sometimes while we were shooting the scene, a way to transition from scene to scene that would connect all of these very disconnected storylines in a way that felt like the women were almost spiritually connected, I guess. And the trouble about asking a real film fan of a screenwriter to do that is that he does it, and then the thing that he's referencing, you go, are you talking about Kitty Wynn in Panic in Needle Park? You son of a... Because he knows it's like, and it comes up like off the dome. He writes that line, and I was like, I know what movie you're talking about. And you're like, she's very pretty, and this is like, she turns to prostitution, she's homeless, she's a drug addict, she betrays her. Like, you're like, damn, that's humbling, man. I think the way that Army of Shadows handles a subject matter where there's a temptation for it to be presented as incredibly heroic, because it's about the French Resistance and these people were heroes, but it really deals very honestly with the kind of bleak and grim reality of these sacrifices, and the way that there was really no glory. But specifically, the epilogue felt like, I don't know, a mirror, or potentially, like No Country, a bit of a justification for this thing, because one of the first things I asked the screenwriter to do when I signed on to direct the movie was change the ending, and include the scene where these two people wake up in the desert. And we were trying to make that the ending, and it was kind of hard to crack it, because the last thing that we wanted to do was leave the audience with a feeling that there even was such a thing as a happy ending to a story like this, or that you could put a bow on it. And I remember sort of suggesting this pretty upsetting epilogue, because it felt like we could give the audience something that was somehow emotionally satisfying without really betraying the deeper truth of this case and of this story, which was that people were continually let down by this system and the culture at the time, and that those things still happen today.